Great. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Champaign Public Library. So nice to have you here this evening on this hot Thursday. My name is Lauren Graham. I'm the business specialist here at the library. Here at the library, we have a number of business services, databases, workshops with local experts, and one-on-one consultations if you want to start or grow a business. We also have this amazing Money Matters series here at the library that's really amazing. I want to go ahead and want to welcome here this evening to Family, Budgeting, Harmony, and Finance. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's presenter. Daly Anderson is passionate about helping people use their financial resources in ways that support their lives and the things that matter most to them. As a wealth advisor with Sterling Wealth Management, she brings over a decade of experience helping families thoughtfully plan their financial lives. Continual learner, Daly is a certified financial planner professional, holds the Chartered Financial Analyst, or CFA, designation, and is a lecturer in the Financial Planning Program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her interest in financially empowering families, entrepreneurs, and women investors extends to our community, where she frequently speaks on topics related to personal leadership and financial education. And I would like to welcome to the stage Daly Anderson.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know that it's a Thursday night at 6 p.m. It's not always the easiest time of day to get away, especially if you do have a family. I know this is family budgeting, so I know this can be a really tricky time sometimes. So I'm really glad that you all could make it here today. So I'm here to talk about budgeting and kind of creating financial harmony within your family by really capturing your cash flow and making sure that it aligns with the things that are most important to you. And so today that's the topic we're going to talk about. Before we get too far ahead, I just want to kind of go over a couple of disclosures. Number one being everybody's financial situation is very different, right? We all have unique situations in how we set up our accounts, how we manage our cash flow, what we spend our money on. And so today I'm going to do my best to give you a really broad education on how, kind of a broad overview of how, kind of a way to frame your budgeting process and how to view cash flow management. But know that this is not specific advice to you. And so if that's something that you're looking for, it's always important to kind of reach out to a professional who can help you with your specific situation. So now that we got that behind us, I wanted to start off with a story. So in preparation for talking about cash flow, talking about budgeting, I liked to kind of test out a new budgeting software. So you probably see these all the time through your iPhone or your smartphone. There's all kinds of different budgeting apps that you can download and can help you kind of categorize your spending to be able to kind of understand and see what you're spending. So I recently tested one of these out. And this is, in the midst of a very busy summer, there was lots of travel, lots of kids sports, just all the things going on, right? And so I wanted to share my experience with you because I think it kind of sets the stage of this is just hard stuff. In concept, sure, you should spend less than you make. But in reality, it's kind of challenging and it does bring up all the feels sometimes. So I downloaded this app and began kind of uploading and linking all of my checking accounts and credit cards so that I could categorize my transactions and kind of summarize where my spending was. So this is all happening in real time, seeing all the lines adding up. I'm looking at it, getting overwhelmed. I feel my heart rate is kind of starting to speed up. My hands feel sweaty. I'm not feeling great about what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the numerous, convenience food and, fast food charges that I know we spent a lot of over the summer because we were so busy. And I kind of identified wow, this is something I do in my professional life, and this is even hard for me. This even brings up some shame in my camp. And so I wanted to normalize that. But shame was not the only emotion that I felt when I was going through that exercise. I certainly felt a little shame when I felt, I saw the convenience food and the Grubhub and those types of charges because I was I probably should have been making the food at home. We had food at home. It was just a convenience thing. But then I saw some transactions related to having a lunch out with a really close friend of mine where I remembered we sat down and we just talked the whole hour and just were able to catch up, and it was a wonderful time. And seeing that transaction on my financial statement actually made me feel really good. Then I also saw transactions for saving towards my kids' college savings, and that made me feel really good as well. And so I kind of recognized through this process that it's not just bad feelings that we have with our spending or with our kind of facing that cash flow piece. It can evoke a lot of feelings. And when we are doing this for the very first time, or it's kind of the first time in a while since we've done this, it can feel a little bit like ripping the Band-Aid off. It may be a little painful at first, right, when we kind of face those things. But the reality is that it's important to do this because we can gain so much better clarity and empowerment over what we're spending and where we're using that money. The thing that I would kind of summarize with this and why we often feel so much emotion when it comes to looking at our spending and making these decisions is that our spending and kind of how we use money is often very closely tied with what we value and how we see ourselves. You know, every transaction often tells a story about what we were doing, where our mind, frame of mind was, the decisions that we were making. And so the closer we are aligned with our values and our spending, the better that feels for us. Sometimes, when we get a skew of that, sometimes that starts to feel not so good. And I think that's something that happens a lot, especially when you've got a family and you're busy. Convenience often will take over because, it's not easy to manage this and track all that spending. And so we're going to kind of talk through, a framework for setting up our cash flow budget so that it's less decision making from day to day and better overview of kind of transparency of what you're spending on. So that being said, we already established that our spending is very closely tied with our feelings and our emotions and our values. And so one of the first exercises I've provided here for you to really take home is a values exercise. So I'll walk you through it so you know kind of what you're doing when you get the chance to sit down and do this. And if you have a partner at home or a family member who you make financial decisions with, take a copy for them. There's some in the back, and you can both use this exercise. So in this exercise, basically, you are going to sit down quietly on your own, and you're going to review this list of, tens and tens of values, okay? The first step is to go through, don't think too hard about it, but circle maybe the top 10 things that you feel really resonate with you and describe how you feel about life and decision making, okay?
Does anybody need a handout? Okay.
Thank you, Lauren. Great. Okay, once you've done that, you're going to go through and you're going to whittle that list down. So certainly all those 10 values that you selected, they probably mean something to you, but if you had to choose, which 4 or 5 would really be the core ones that you feel like resonate with you and drive decision making for you, or you really feel that that's a description of who you are, okay? So I've made an example here. So the final kind of decision here for this person is family. Oops. Oh, gosh. Going the wrong way. Family, freedom, and stability. Okay? If you're doing this with a partner or another family member or somebody you make decisions with, they may have very different values, right? And there's no right or wrong words to choose. Essentially, all of these words on this page here are really noble, honorable values. And just because you might choose, the word freedom over education doesn't mean you don't value education. What we're really trying to get to here is those driving values that overarching are kind of the most important to you. All right. So once you've evaluated what those kind of core themes of your life are, these are some kind of conversations and questions for you to consider yourself or to have in a conversation or discussion with a partner. So, for example, this person has the 3 words family, freedom, and stability. So the first question here is, what does family, or any of those other core values listed, what does that really mean to you? In the example here of family, you might wonder, okay, what constitutes my family? Who's in my family? Do I mean a spouse and children? Does that extend beyond my immediate family where I'm including my parents, my grandparents, my nieces and nephews and sisters and brothers? what does that look like for you? And maybe that even includes very close friends. So really kind of drilling down and understanding who are those important people to you. If the term is freedom, you might ask yourself, what does freedom mean to me? You know, and how does that show up in how I make decisions about my time and my money? So for somebody who might have a characteristic or a core value of freedom, sometimes that can present a little bit of tension, right? Especially when we're making financial decisions. So if I feel like freedom is a core value of mine, I might not feel like I want to be constricted when it comes to what I spend my money on, right? But the catch-22 is that in order to not have that constriction, I need to actually restrict myself today, right? So kind of thinking through how those core values show up in your life and how you make decisions. One thing I mentioned here is that, you know, it's really not just how these values show up in financial decisions. I think it's kind of important to note that our time is another resource. It's a very, very important resource that we all have, and it's often very, you know, linked to how we're making decisions about money as well. And so considering that in terms of how you spend your time. And then how does it feel when you are in alignment with your values? So when you feel like you've made a decision that feels good, that, you know, feels like that's supporting the person that you want to be and the family that, you know, those values that your family has, how does that feel in contrast to one like my decision over the summer where it was just, there was a little too much of like the food budget, right? That didn't make me feel super great. All right. So now that we've established what our core values are when it comes to money, the next kind of topic here is going to be about really understanding how that interplays with financial goals and priorities that we might set. So the practice of financial planning and budgeting is really this careful balancing act between the tension of what we need and want today and what we're going to need and want in the future. That's really what it is. It's a teeter-totter. Okay? The tough thing is knowing what we're going to need and want in the future. And that might mean next week, next year, or 15 years from now. It's very hard to really understand who we're going to be and what we're going to need and want. Might be easy to understand kind of where you are today, but not so much in 15 or 20 years. And research has actually shown that the further out we think about our future self, the more it is like thinking of a stranger, right? So it's kind of like thinking about another person. We don't quite relate to that future self the same way that we relate to the person we are today. But I think we might all agree that in 15 to 20 years, we aren't going to need and want anything less than what we have today. So this is an exercise that you can really easily do at home. That basically, it's a timeline. So you can see here at the very top, we have a horizontal timeline for the number of years out these goals might be, okay? And on this vertical column here, we've got a listing of different categories. So things that, you know, like might be related to family and relationships, home and environment, leisure, toys, recreation, education and development, work, career, charitable giving, community, and spiritual. And you can label really any category that you want. So if that doesn't speak to you, you can make your own, okay? The beauty of this is, especially, you know, if you're sitting down and doing this as an exercise, is that you can really kind of think through the different milestones that you might expect in your life and how that will affect your life financially. So, like I mentioned before, the first 12 months, the first 1 to 12 months, that may not be quite as difficult because we kind of see that as near term. You know, we probably already know what's on the calendar through, at least through October, right? So this is just an example that I put together for a family here, and they've got a plan they're gonna take a trip to Six Flags. And the work side, they're working towards a promotion that they hope to achieve soon. Charitable and giving, right now they're at a position that they like to give and they like to be able to volunteer. As we go out a little bit further, sometimes those goals are a little bit less specific, but they're there nonetheless. This family might think, well, you know, I know our house is aging and I know that there's certain improvements that we're going to make. They identified, hey, we need some new windows. It might be a new paint on the walls, something like that. But they know they're going to need to earmark some funds to cover those types of improvements. And we can go out further. In this situation, we've got in 6 to 10 years, in 6 to 10 years, they're going to be helping their children kind of support them as the kids maybe go to college or are launched into adulthood. And then finally, 11 to 20 years, we're getting even further out, maybe a little bit less specific. We've got retirement on the horizon. And then lifetime, this can be a very long period of time. Annual vacations, leaving a legacy, maybe being able to help grandchildren support their education. And as we go through this exercise, it's a really good idea to kind of consider how the goals that you are considering and identifying, how they relate to your values. We kind of already established that when our goals and our financial decisions closely align with our values, that feels really good. And that's kind of us living in alignment with how we want our lives to be. Other thing I want to mention is that a lot of times in couples and in partnerships where you're making joint financial decisions together, a lot of times, in my experience, what I've seen is that one partner might be a little bit more focused and prioritize the present life, while the other partner might be a little more focused on the future, maybe worried about the future and saving for it. And you know what, I think sometimes that comes across as a challenge, because when we're making a financial decision, we've got one who's saying, no, we shouldn't spend that today, we shouldn't go on that trip because you never know, our car might break down, we need to make sure that we've got enough savings here to kind of bolster any future needs we might have. Whereas the other spouse or the other partner may be thinking, no, we really need, we live one life, we need to live for today, our kids are only young once. So it's a little bit of a dichotomy that can feel like a challenge, and it can create some conflict, especially in relationships. What I want to say about that is that both elements of that conversation are so important, because we actually need both of those sides when we're making financial decisions. We can't just live for today and live for what's going on, and we also can't just live for the future. It's a careful balance between both of those elements. So a lot of times I see that as actually really a strength, even though it can come across sometimes as a conflict. If we can reframe that with our partner and really consider that that's actually a strength. Right. So I would love to stand here and tell you that budgeting is easy, and I've got this magic answer for you that you're just going to set it up and you don't have to track anything, you don't have to look at anything again, but reality is that it doesn't work that way. It takes time, it takes commitment, and ultimately it does take discipline. Motivation might be really high at first, but motivation only lasts so long, and it can wane very quickly, especially when we encounter the challenges and all the emotions that sometimes come when we're facing, the dreaded budget, like facing all those expenses. Sometimes we can experience some early wins in this process. For example, identifying and canceling a subscription that was like a monthly subscription that, gosh, I got to cancel that. Hooray, win! That's a win. But it can be easy sometimes to confuse action for progress. So you want to keep your eye on the prize. You want to think through long-term, setting this up in a disciplined way, and establishing kind of safeguards so that you're intentionally taking time to monitor and make sure that this is set up to help you and allow you to make progress. So the approach that I'm going to introduce today is called flow-based cash flow, so flow-based budgeting. It's a type of budgeting system that it can be adapted for different situations. The example I'm going to walk through is very basic. I will try to give you some exceptions to the rules here and there, but know that it can be adapted, okay? It's designed for families for whom budgeting historically has been dreaded, hasn't gone well, and that might be because it's a lot of work to track all of the expenses. Yes, I see some nodding faces here. It could also be that there's just this sense of analysis paralysis. You feel like you're having to make such big decisions every time you pull out your pocketbook. And it can also just be that, you're kind of losing motivation. You've done enough, you've seen some progress, and gosh, it was a lot of work, so we're just going to call it a win and move on. All right? But in this approach, we are going to categorize our spending into 3 different buckets, okay? We've got our fixed bucket here on the left, our flexible expenses here, and our non-monthly expenses and savings. And we're gonna set up our fixed expense bucket here. It's gonna be typically the majority of our monthly expenses. We're gonna set this puppy up to run on autopilot. This is passive. We don't wanna make a lot of decisions on this bucket. We kind of know that those fixed expenses, like our housing, our utilities, etc., they're just gonna run every month. We don't have to make a decision. So we're gonna eliminate that noise from our head. Our mid bucket here, let's see, actually I'm gonna skip to, this is our non-monthly bucket here. This can be a little complex, right? Because some expenses that we have are not on a monthly basis. They may be like property taxes or insurance premiums where we're paying them every 6 months or just sporadically through the year. So that one's gonna be a little bit more active than these fixed expenses, but ultimately, we remove this element from your daily transactions so that you kind of remove that noise as well. You don't check it quite as frequently, okay? And then the final bucket, which is really here in the middle, are flexible expenses. These are the things that we make active decisions on pretty much a daily basis. So these are the things that not only are active decisions, but we also have some control typically over the amount of that expense. Now, okay, so I'm gonna go through kind of what the overall process looks like for setting up this cash flow-based budgeting process. So as I mentioned before, it is work to set up a budget, and it is work to maintain it and make sure that it's set up appropriately so that you're making progress. The biggest effort is here at the very beginning, creating the infrastructure. So like anything, like building a house, building a building, you gotta make sure that like your framework and your foundation is super solid so that you don't have problems down the road, okay? So that's what we're gonna focus the most on today, is creating this kind of infrastructure. So in that, creating this infrastructure, we're going to talk about determining our monthly income, so how much are we earning, identifying categorizing our expenses between the 3 buckets we have here, establishing optimal balances between the 3 accounts, because we don't want to run it too thin. We want to make sure that if there's ever a situation where expenses are different than expected, we've got a buffer. And then we're going to implement a monthly transfer flow. So we're going to try to set this up so it's as automated as possible. So there are fewer and fewer decisions that you have to make on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Okay? The second part of this process is establishing positive habits. And this is something, establishing positive habits and scheduling maintenance. These are things that are ongoing and that, there we go, that are ongoing and we will continue to do, for the life of how we spend our money, okay? So some of those things are going to be monitoring balances and transactions weekly, especially with the active spending account, the flexible expenses. And then establish spending parameters. So, for example, identifying what expenses are going to be spent from which accounts. So for our flexible expenses, that's where we're going to make those daily decisions. If you go out to lunch, you're spending from your flexible account. If you're going to go buy a coffee, flex account. If you're going to go to the grocery store, flex account. And so in that same vein, you might only carry 1 debit card for your flexible spending account. Another example is semi-annual property taxes. Where is that going to come from? That's going to come from the non-monthly expense. Okay? So for all of the different expenses that you have, you will know where they're paid from, because you determine that when you consider your infrastructure, okay? When you set it up. And then final step here is scheduling maintenance. So really in a very deliberate way, making sure that you have set aside time at different intervals to ensure that things are running well and that you're making progress. So an example, especially on the early end, is having bi-weekly or every other week reviews in advance of each payroll. Another thing in scheduling maintenance is creating a framework for regular monitoring, so that when it comes time for you to kind of look at the overview of your financial health, you know what you're looking at, right? You don't have to come up with this framework every single time you're sitting down you will know, oh, I need to look at my balances, I need to look at the transactions, I need to look at how things are growing. So we'll go through that as well. And then finally, monitoring progress towards goals. This is all in greater purpose of living more in alignment with what's important to us. So making sure that it's working. Okay. All right, so here's a summary of how the flow actually works. I'm gonna walk around here because there's some moving parts to it. So right here, we've got our payroll. So our payroll goes into our checking account number 1. But before it hits our account, we're gonna pay our deductions. So depending on where you work, you may have your employer withhold for taxes. They may withhold retirement account contributions like a 401k or a defined benefit plan, health insurance, flex spending for like daycare, things like health, and HSA might be a health savings account. These are just some examples. You may have some of them, you may have none of them, you may have more of them. But the end result is that your paycheck is net of all of these deductions. So that goes into your first checking account, which is for your fixed expenses. So from your checking account, you are first going to establish auto pay for all of your fixed expenses. So anything that you can identify as being monthly, recurring, in a very similar amount each month is going to be auto debited from your fixed account. Just set it up. Those expenses will include long-term savings and investments. Okay, those are considered kind of in this framework. They're considered part of this kind of fixed expense. So again, we want to kind of balance those needs, that tension between today and tomorrow. And so that's going to mean, whatever those goals might be. Maybe it's a future home purchase and you're saving for a down payment. You set that aside every month. Maybe it's retirement accounts. You're going to set that aside every month. Or kids accounts, or just future lifestyle. Okay, that goes in separate accounts. From this checking account number, from the checking account number 1, where the fixed expenses are, we're going to set up transfer flows. So every month, we're going to set up a flow from the fixed expense account to the non-monthly expenses and savings. Okay. What we're going to do here is we know that the monthly expenses are going to vary quite a bit from this third account. Some months it's going to be higher, other months it's going to be lower. What we're going to do is we're going to figure out what we need in there on a average monthly basis. We're going to set up additional savings as well in this account so that there's a buffer, and then we're going to allow this to run. Okay. And then the final transfer is going to be from the fixed expenses, this bucket here, into your flexible expense checking account. So these are 3 different checking accounts. Now, the flexible expense checking account, the amount that's transferred in there is a little bit of a plug figure because we know that we have to cover these fixed expenses. We know we need to have enough in here to cover our non-monthly expenses and to have adequate savings. And so what is left is typically going to go into our flexible expenses. And we're going to check this. We want to make sure that it's still adequate to meet what we think our needs are. But because there is some discretion over the amount and timing of these decisions, we're going to use this as a kind of a plug figure. So we'll do the math and figure out what's left. That goes into the flexible expense category. All right. So I'm going to talk about these categories and the types of expenses that we put into each of them. Okay. So this first category here is fixed expenses. So those are going to be things like mortgage or rent, your phone bill, your utilities, insurance premiums, childcare potentially, your savings, gym membership, your Netflix, all the subscriptions that happen on a monthly basis. Okay. The beauty of the fixed expenses is they are passive. The decision has already been made that you're paying them. We assume you continue. Okay. We're not making decisions on a weekly basis or a monthly basis on that. We just let it roll. Everything's set on auto pay. It's going to typically be about 50% or more of your spending. That's kind of on average, that's kind of what we see. So it's going to take away a lot of the noise from your daily decision making. Okay. Next, we're going to move into the flexible expenses. These are going to be things like buying groceries, household goods, paper towels, toilet paper, all that good stuff. Eating out might be for convenience or going out for entertainment, gifts, activities, gas, shopping. These expenses are active decisions. We often have discretion over the timing and to some extent the amount that we spend as well. We want to establish, for like the greatest success, we want to actually establish weekly spending targets, because what that allows us to do is to kind of have like this guardrail, and keeps us a little bit more accountable. So if we know that like our weekly spend figure is $300 or $200 or $500, we know that that's how much we have to spend this week. And if we go over, we might need to spend a little bit less the following week. Or if we go under, we have a little bit more we can spend the following week. That's kind of what the flow is that it's okay if it goes over a little or under a little, as long as through that month you are staying within the budget. And we set it up on a weekly basis in order to kind of give that accountability help. Some people might not choose to do it that way, but that's often a good way to set it up. Okay. We're going to solve for the flexible expenses, like I mentioned before. It's kind of the plug figure. It's the difference between what comes in minus fixed expenses and non-monthly and savings. All right. So our non-monthly expenses and savings. So this is actually an account that's going to hold money to cover the non-monthly expenses as well as our emergency fund. So it's going to be a much more substantial balance, because we want to try to, over time at least, establish a healthy emergency fund for providing resilience. Things happen in life that we don't expect. Your car the tire might blow and you need to replace the tire, and that's really expensive. And you don't want to derail yourself because you don't have that kind of backup plan. And so that's the beauty of this non-monthly and savings, is that it's going to include money to pay for the non-monthly expenses as well as kind of that emergency fund. So medical expenses, above and beyond like a small copay, auto repairs, kids sports, holidays, vacations, charitable giving, and that emergency fund. So this is going to be less frequent expenses. It's going to have the largest balance of the 3 accounts, and it's going to include your savings. Okay, so now we're going to try to put this in action. So I've got a case study here. So these are the Jacksons. This is Don and Marina. So Don's 42. He's a manager at a local hotel. Marina's 38, and she works part-time as an administrative assistant. Their total income is about $60,000 a year, and they have 2 adorable children, Marta, who's 6, and Isaac, who's 4. We're going to try to help them set up their monthly flow-based budget. Okay? So the first step in setting up the infrastructure is to know what is coming in. What is our income? Okay? So to start, I'm going to download our most recent pay stub so we can determine our net pay. So what's the gross amount less those deductions? Really important to understand how frequently you get paid. This can be really tricky sometimes. You probably know if you get paid monthly, because that's pretty straightforward. You know when to expect it. But some people get paid bi-weekly, so it's actually 26 pay periods in the year, and some people get paid twice a month, so there's only 24 pay periods in a year. So that distinction can actually be pretty important when you're budgeting. So ensuring that you kind of understand the specificity of your payment frequency is important. So Don and Marina, they pulled up their monthly pay stubs and they combined it here on this page. So their monthly gross income is $5,000. If you multiply that by 12 months, that means they're earning about $60,000 a year. They have health insurance deducted, about $150 a month. 401k, so Don has access to a 401k plan at work. That's a retirement savings plan. And he is making contributions of $250 a month, and that entitles him to actually get a match contribution from his employer. So he's making sure he takes advantage of that. And then finally, they've got taxes of about $350 a month deducted from their paychecks. That leaves us with about $4,250 that we can work with on a monthly basis. Okay. All right. Moving forward. So we're going to identify our expenses. That's the next step. So we want to know, with some granularity, what are we spending on, especially for our fixed expenses, because we are setting this puppy up on auto pay. All right, so for the Jacksons, we have fixed expenses. They own their home, and they have a mortgage. So they've got a mortgage payment. Their mortgage includes homeowner's insurance and property taxes. That kind of saves the day for them. They don't have to add those to the non-monthly buckets. It's all kind of escrowed at the bank for them. So that's $1,300 a month. They pay about $180 in utilities. Now, as we all know, we live here in Champaign. That can fluctuate quite a bit depending on the weather and the season. So one thing I'm going to talk about with this is making sure we've got adequate balance in this account so that if there are slight fluctuations from month to month, that it's not going to harm us, right? We've got enough buffer. We've got auto insurance. They've got a monthly plan on that, so $300. Childcare, about $200 a month. Memberships, gym membership maybe for $80. And now they also have long-term investments that are set up. So $125 each to Roth IRAs, and they're also saving $75 a month to kind of their future lifestyle. So kind of setting it for the future. So their total fixed expenses are about $23.85 a month. That's a little bit more than half of about $42.50, right? So that's kind of what we typically see is those fixed expenses tend to be the majority of our monthly spending. Now, here's the fun part. If you find any monthly expenses that you don't use, you can cancel them. No worries. You don't need to go through the process of setting up an auto pay for things you don't want anymore. So that can be a quick win that feels pretty good. All right. So now we're going to solve for the non-monthly expenses, and this one's a lot trickier because they are not regular, and they happen throughout the year. So sometimes it can be easy to kind of forget. I don't know about you, but it might be easy to forget. Like, oh, wait a minute, that bill comes in September every year. So this is the opportunity to kind of sit down and look through your former bank statements or credit card statements to get an idea of what those expenses are over that 1 year period. To be able to identify them, to be able to kind of predict them for the future. So for this family, they had quite a bit of medical expenses in the past year. They had about $2,500 a year. So that is something that may increase, may decrease, depending on the health experience over the year, how often your kids get sick. If you are expecting a baby, for example, that expense might go up quite a bit in that year. So that's something that, depending on your health insurance plan, you can do a little bit of research based on what you know to find out what your deductible is and your out-of-pocket expense might be. That can give you a little bit of guidance to understand how much you might want to earmark for that expense, okay? They had expenses about $2,500 last year, so they're going to earmark $208 a month to make sure that they've got funds set aside for those expenses that come up. Kids' activities, the sports, all the stuff, the camps, etc. $500 a year, they're going to allocate $42 a month to that. Vacations, they spend about $750. Holiday spending, they want to make sure that they've earmarked that so they don't have to wonder where it's coming from at the holidays. Charitable giving, they have a goal to give about $75 now every year. And then a sinking fund. Oops. Wow. Got way ahead of me. Okay, so a sinking fund. So a sinking fund is essentially a way to grow a balance in an account that provides you with available cash for miscellaneous expenses or for things that are future goals. So for example, if this family has a goal to purchase a new car next year, and they want to save enough to have a very significant down payment, they might kind of set up a line item for that in a sinking fund. Like every month they're going to set aside $188 until they have a significant enough balance to go ahead and make that purchase. Does that make sense? So this is where, when we go through that goals exercise and you can identify, well, I've got all these upcoming expenses, they go in these non-monthly expenses and savings bucket. And you can create specific lines. So it doesn't have to be called sinking fund. It could be called car savings line. It could be called window replacement line. It could be, whatever it is. Sometimes it's very nice to be able to see that and kind of have that clarity that you have funds going towards that. Okay? All right. Now finally, here's our plug figure, the flexible expenses. So this can be trickier because sometimes there's more discretion over this area of spending. So probably the best bet is to kind of review recent bank statements and get an idea of your average expenses in different categories. So for groceries, for eating out, for all those things that we mentioned before, household needs, activities and entertainment, those are things that might really just show up on your credit card statement or your bank statement, and you can kind of take a look and say, you know what, on average I spent about this, just to make sure that the numbers, that you're not cutting yourself short, okay? So we calculated about $650 for groceries, eating out, fast food, and these are all estimates. The bottom line here is $1,300, and this is a plug figure, and I'll show you in the next slide how we made sure that that math worked, okay? So that $1,300 is equal to our monthly income of $4,200 less our fixed expenses of $2,385 less $556 a month. That's where we got this, okay? And so from this number, we can say, okay, I'm gonna spend about $650 a month on groceries, $150 on eating out and fast food. So you can kind of use that number to then plug these expense categories. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. And then you can calculate what that annual figure would look like as well for these different categories. Groceries and food for families tend to be a pretty big expense, especially now after we've experienced a lot of inflation. The price, that's just what we have noticed. Okay. So we're going to break this down a little bit into weekly spending targets. So we know that on a monthly basis we want to spend about $1,300, but on a weekly basis, that if we divide the annual amount by 52 weeks, that gives us $300 a week that we can spend. So now we know, okay, we're going to target a monthly or a weekly spend figure of $300. All right. All right, so the next slide here is talking about how do you determine the optimal account balance for each of these expenses here. So the first tip here is to what's called age your money. So this means that in your accounts, you really want to avoid living paycheck to paycheck. That just causes a lot of stress. You run the risk of going insufficient funds, like you have to make timing decisions. Ideally, you want to do what's called age your money. So you want to establish a buffer, meaning that in an optimal world, you have 1 month's worth of earnings as kind of the base level in this account. And then on top of that, you receive your next month's earnings. And so when you're spending your monthly expenses, you're actually spending last month's earnings. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're always getting a month ahead. You have the monthly income from the previous month, and you're going to spend that next month on that next month's expenses.
That's what age your money is.
That's what age your money is.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just started doing
Oh, good. Good. And so with that, kind of aging your money, if you don't have the cash on hand yet to kind of set up the adequate, 2 times your monthly expenses in the fixed account, etc., that's perfectly okay, right? There are ways to kind of strive to save a portion of your earnings every month so that you're not spending all of it every month. So over time, it will actually age your money. It will increase that kind of buffer that you hold in each of those accounts so that you're not running quite as close. Because again, really that bottom line is you just don't want to have to live paycheck to paycheck. You want to be a month ahead. Okay. Let's see. The other thing that determines how much balance you should have in these accounts is kind of the stability of your income sources. So if you have very stable, predictable income, that's pretty easy to plan for. It's pretty easy to kind of structure, you know what's coming in, and for the most part, you might know what's going out. If you have lumpier income or more, ups and downs in your income flows, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. And so having a higher cash balance in each of these accounts would actually be more beneficial, so that in periods or months where you don't earn as much, you have kind of a buffer to cover those expenses. Another important thing here is to really understand and review the terms of your checking accounts. So again, you'll have 3 checking accounts, and you want to make sure that you understand what the terms are with those accounts. So is there a minimum balance that you need to maintain in each account in order to avoid fees? Is it a minimum that's averaged between all of the accounts? Are there certain stipulations that you have to have auto pay on or ACHs in from your payroll? You want to understand all those things because I'll tell you that looking at bank fees will not make you feel good. It's not one of those expenses that gives you the warm and fuzzy, like we just don't do it, okay? And so having a good understanding of what you need to do to set this up so that you're not incurring those bank fees. And if your current bank is charging you those fees, and you don't find a way that you can kind of avoid them, it's perfectly fine to look for another option. There's a lot of banks out there.
So 3 different banks?
No, not 3 different, good question. Not 3 different banks, put them in the same financial institution for ease. Yeah, so that you, when you open your app or you open the online access, you can see all of your accounts right there. Great question, thank you. All right, and then finally, you want to set up overdraft protection. Okay, so overdraft protection is basically kind of a technique that they allow at the same financial institution, banking institution, where they basically, if you have an expense and you don't have the funds to cover it in that particular account, they will cover it. They won't deny the expense. They won't turn it away. But what they will do is you will have one funding account that will be set up. So if, for example, your flexible expense account, you accidentally overdraw it, your monthly savings, funds from your monthly savings will be transferred automatically to cover that deficit so that you don't go insufficient funds. There's typically a fee for when that happens, when you need to have overdraft advantage go on, or protection when that type of transfer happens, but it's a lot less typically than if it goes insufficient funds. Does that make sense? Everyone? Okay, good. And really, you never want to be in that, you don't want to get to that situation. You want to try to manage it so that's not, something that you're going to run into. But it is a really good protection to have in place.
So no savings account, just checkings?
That's 2.0. That is 2.0. Yes, that's a very good point. Yes. So we talked about how there can be adaptability for all of these different structures. And if you're at the point that you've saved sufficiently in kind of that emergency fund and you're setting aside funds for other expenses that might be 6 months or a year down the road, you could potentially get a lot more interest, a lot more yield from your money if you do like a high yield savings. And so that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Yeah. So for this example, we're kind of trying to keep it simple, but that is like the 2.0 and a very good example of how you can adapt this based on what your needs are. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. Okay. All right, so determining the amount that you want to maintain in cash balances. So this is your fixed account, for your fixed expenses. Typically, an optimal amount to kind of maintain here would be 2 times your monthly fixed expenses. So in this event, their fixed expenses are about $2,400 a month, so we multiply that by 2. So they should keep a balance around $5,600 so that they're always a month ahead of what their expenses are. They never run the risk of, running dry, okay? All right, in our flexible spending account, this is an interesting one. So this doesn't necessarily need to maintain a large balance. Part of the trick of setting up this flexible spending account and having this targeted weekly spend is that it kind of tricks your mind into this scarcity a little bit, where it's like you see the figure and you know that you have that money to work with. Now, not everybody necessarily needs or would want that. So, if you don't need that assistance on kind of that extra accountability, then you can maintain, a month's worth, for example, of spending in this account, and that's no problem at all. But if you do want that extra accountability, you can hold a slightly smaller balance in this account and just do transfers a little bit more frequently. So instead of once a month, you could set up, 2 times a month or every 2 weeks transfers from the fixed account so that you're not dealing with as much cash in that account that you could very easily spend. So if you kind of want to know, like, I feels like cash floating a hole in my pocket, like if you kind of want that extra accountability, you can set it up that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so for this person, their target might be about $600. Now, caveat here is that many bank accounts that might be, that might incur fees, you know, depending on what their minimum balance is. So again, that's really important to understand your bank and understand ways to avoid that. So we definitely want to avoid that at all costs. Okay. All right. Now the third account, which is our non-monthly fixed, it's going to include a balance for those non-monthly expenses as well as our savings and emergency fund. And yeah, it's a checking, but when it grows substantial enough, you can actually pare this out. And that's a great idea. Okay. So for this family, I'm going to show you how we kind of calculated what that optimal balance is. All right. So the first thing is for this non-monthly expense figure, we're going to say we want to try to accumulate about 6 months worth of expenses. That's going to give us a really good buffer because depending what time of year and when your expenses hit, you know, you may, that very first month, you may have a really big out-of-pocket expense because it happens to be October and that's when your insurance premiums are due, right? So depending on that timing, it's good to be able to kind of pre-fund that account with a good, you know, 3 to 6 months worth of those expenses, okay? So in this case, funding that is going to be about $370 times 6, which is about $2,200 as kind of the target initial balance. You may notice, just in case you do notice, that $370 is about $200 less than what our non-monthly expenses, you know, that we identified. And that's because in the original, where we identified those non-monthly expenses, we had some allocated towards a sinking fund, okay? So that's kind of, you know, that's kind of extra. So we only calculated what the expenses were, okay? All right, and then the second part of this is establishing an emergency fund, okay? And so this emergency fund, a typical good balance, like optimal balance to strive for, is about 4 months of net pay. For this family, you know, you may have heard anywhere from 6 to 12 months worth of fixed expenses. That's another kind of back of the envelope type of recommendation. For this family, it ends up being about 4 months of net pay. So that accounts for about $17,000. Okay, so that gives us a starting kind of optimal balance of about $19,220 in this account. Now, like I mentioned before, don't be alarmed by the size of that, you know, initial optimal funding. I think the big thing to look at here and kind of the important piece is to have the non-monthly target balance. So to start with this. And over time, you know, if the emergency fund, you know, is not adequate or is not kind of, don't have that cash on hand yet, that can be part of these non-monthly expenses. So every month you can be allocating, you know, $50, $100, whatever it might be, towards building this greater balance to be able to have kind of this emergency fund. Does that make sense? You guys? Okay. Great. All right, so that target balance, like I said before, is about $19,000. Okay, finally, we're going to set this up. So here we go. We're going to set up all the flows. So we start with our net pay of about $42.50. That goes directly into our first checking account, which is where our fixed expenses are. We're going to set all of those fixed expenses up on auto pay, including our monthly savings targets or investment targets. And then we're going to set up automatic flow transfers, okay? Just like automatic payments, we're going to set up these automatic transfers within our banking system. So we're going to fund our non-monthly expenses and savings. We're going to transfer $556, and we're going to set this automatic so we don't have to touch it every month on our paycheck, okay? And then we're going to set up another auto transfer. And again, this is where you have some discretion over how frequently you want to set that up. You can set it up so that it's paid out monthly, so $13.05 per month into this flexible spending account. Or if you want that kind of added accountability and kind of that tricking your mind into that scarcity, you could transfer it a smaller amount more frequently. So you could transfer $300 a week and set that up automatically. Or you could do $600 a month, for example. Okay? And then we want to make sure that the math is mathing, that everything is correct. So we're going to take our net income, $42.50 to $42.48. We're going to take out our fixed expenses, our flexible expenses, and then our non-monthly. And sorry. Lo and behold, our final figure is $0, so everything balances out. Okay? So now we're going to kind of talk about some of the behavior that can really help us, lead us into setting this up well and working towards different progress and goals, okay? Making sure that things are running smoothly and things like that. So motivation can only take you so far because it can wane very quickly. It seems so great at first, right? You can muscle through this, but in reality, things get tough when you're budgeting. It's not that fun.
Yes, it is.
It is not fun. So we want to make sure that we're kind of setting up these easy behaviors and like quick checks to make sure that, you know, we're running this correctly, okay? And that's honestly, part of this is why we're setting up our fixed expenses this way, so that we don't have to make those decisions. We eliminate that noise on a monthly basis. We don't have to really look at it. We can check in on a monthly basis, make sure it's running smoothly, but it kind of goes on its own. And then for our non-monthly expenses, once that balance is kind of funded, that should mostly run on its own as well. We certainly have to check to make sure the balance is adequate to make our expense payments when there are bigger ones, but it should be set up so that it's just not as high maintenance. And so really what you're dealing with is you're just making your decisions on this. So it kind of eliminates some of that like analysis paralysis and like the constant checking. And the other thing is that with these flexible expenses, it really doesn't matter what you're spending that money on. I mean, so long as you cover those basics and you know that you got the food and all of that good stuff. But you know, if you decide one week that you're going to spend a little bit more going out and getting a babysitter and going out to dinner, that's perfectly fine. There's no judgment in that account. As long as you're kind of meeting that flow every week, and over that month period, you're kind of averaging out $1,300, it's good to go. All right, so here's our positive money habits to implement. So set that weekly spending target for the flex spending account, and then monitor that regularly. So you will want to look at that, every week, maybe a couple times a week, depending on, where you fall. And if you're working with a partner, on spending that, that's where communication is really, really important, because you're both spending from that flex spending account, okay? So there may be, like I mentioned before, there can be some adaptations that you make to this. There may be that, you both decide, hey, I've got $150, you've got $150, and we're gonna, I'm gonna buy the groceries this week, you buy it next week, okay? Consider setting up those weekly transfer flows for the flex spending account in order to kind of establish those guardrails and that accountability. Automate all fixed expenses. Carry only your debit card from the flex spending account. So that way you don't get confused of, oh, should I use this account or this account? Well, if it's a daily expense, it's coming from the flex spending. Establish spending parameters. So determine in advance which expenses you're going to cover from each account. And there is some discretion on this as well. So for example, if you need to purchase a new work wardrobe, that's probably, it might be more than what your kind of weekly spending target might be. And so that might be something where you set up one of those transfer flows into the non-monthly expenses and say, I'm gonna save for this for the next month or so, and then I'm gonna spend from this, okay? So there are situations where an expense might be considered, kind of that flexible expense, or it might be considered non-monthly, depending on kind of that size, okay? Keep track of upcoming non-monthly expenses. That's always important to kind of check that balance and just kind of know what's coming up. And then establish and set aside time for regular monitoring and maintenance. And this is really important. To not do it to be proactive about it rather than reactive, because nobody likes to like put out the fire. It's better if we can monitor it and just make sure things are running smoothly than if things break and then we have to fix it, okay? Especially on the early end as things get set up. So this is an example of kind of setting up a framework for monitoring your progress, monitoring how the cash flow is working, and making sure that you're moving in the right direction, okay? So I've set up some examples here. So for this family, we've got your life themes. It's always good to kind of be a reminder when we're making financial decisions. Oh yeah, that's important. Your goals timeline. So I kind of made a truncated timeline here of some of those important goals for this family so that it's top of mind and right in front of our face, like, yes, we need to make sure that we're saving enough for these home improvements. And actually, in addition to the window replacement, we're probably gonna need X, Y, and Z. So it's kind of a conversation starter, okay? Then upcoming expenses, you can list out some of these non-monthly expenses here that might be kind of coming up that you wanna make sure that you're checking the balance to say, okay, does this look good? We've got plenty of cash in here, things are looking good. So for this example, property taxes, insurance premiums, summer camp fees, replace windows in 2026. Next, we're going to kind of track our progress, and one way to do that is to track your net worth and create a balance sheet for yourself. So a balance sheet is kind of a snapshot in time of your assets, what you own, and your liabilities, what you owe, okay? So you can set it up by listing out your accounts, things that you own here, and the value, and then totaling that value right here at the bottom. In this example, because I wanted to monitor the progress, I put in a 2023 value and now a 2024 value. You know, you can trick this out however you want to. You can do it on a monthly basis. You can track like how am I doing this month versus last month, or it can be year over year. You can even, if you've been doing this long enough, you can track the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So you're gonna see the growth of your assets over time. And then here I made a column for the dollar change. So you can see it grew about 17,800. And now I'm tracking liabilities. So we had a mortgage at the beginning of that time period of 75,000, and just through the monthly payments, now it's only 72,000. So that's going to give you credit for another $3,000 adding to kind of your grand assets. So then you can see the grand total, which is going to be your assets minus anything that you owe. You can see here it's about 55,000 in 2024, and then you can kind of track that over time. What was the change? The next thing to review is the cash balance, so looking more specifically at your banking accounts, taking a look to ensure that your fixed expenses, that you've got that good buffer, so you can kind of see, do I have about 2 times our fixed expenses in that account currently? It's also a good opportunity to take a look and see, because while we say they're fixed, we live in Illinois and some of them fluctuate, right? That's just the reality. Am I seeing trends? Like, for example, has my insurance premium gone up significantly? Like, that's really important to know because that's going to impact this automation in a fixed account. So those are things that you want to keep an eye on and look at. You also want to make sure that even though you have things automated, that you are looking at the statements, because even if they're electronic statements, sometimes you'll see an extra fee for something, or you'll notice, like, for example, we have Comcast at home. And Comcast, when you call them sometimes, they will give you a great deal, and it only lasts so long. Or, you know what I'm talking about, right? So it'll last like 18 months or something really strange, like 16 months. So like you never really remember, like, is that September or October? I don't know. But how you realize it is like, oh, my bill just went up. Yeah, so you gotta look at it. And it gives you kind of that prompt to make a call, figure it out, and make adjustments, okay? And then we wanna make sure the flex spending accounts, that's running well. One thing that sometimes people might run into if they have excess cash flow, so if their income goes up and they haven't adjusted their expenses, is that they might accumulate more of a balance in fixed expenses. And so kind of deciding, well, what do we do with that balance? Does that go towards, spending more discretionary spending, or a shorter term goal in savings, or is that something we want to put towards long term? Okay. So these are things to kind of monitor over time. And then the non-monthly, of course, making sure that balance is growing over time, or that you've got an adequate emergency fund. And if it's growing excessively, so that now you've got more, making sure that you're putting it to use, and that might mean like a high yield savings account. Okay? And making sure that there's adequate funds in there to cover these upcoming expenses, and that you're making progress towards being able to achieve these more longer term, but also short term expenses, the bigger ones. And then finally, we didn't talk a lot about this, but investments. So that is going to be that fixed expense. We want to make sure we're saving for our future, which doesn't just mean putting it in a bank account and earning interest. It also means kind of investing it and ensuring that we have growth opportunity with it. So that might be your 401k and your retirement accounts, or an investment account. So you want to kind of include this in the snapshot. Yes?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So instead of me doing the 3 checkings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be a good idea to, like, whatever bills I can put on my credit card,
Good question.
and then just setting up auto pay for the credit card so I can get the like cash back.
Yeah. I'm gonna repeat it because it's being recorded. Excellent question. So, you asked whether it makes sense, instead of setting up 3 separate checking accounts,
Yeah.
to set your auto payments on a credit card,
Yeah.
and then setting up a transfer flow to pay off the credit card every single month, and that might be weekly or it might be monthly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when I talked about adaptability, that is a really good option. So most people, many people I should say, do use credit for certain expenses. And like you mentioned, there is opportunity to use credit and use it wisely and get opportunities like cash back or travel rewards and things like that. And so that is definitely a really good option. So yeah, I definitely approve of that. And there's ways to do that. So you can set it up, like a flexible, for the flex spending account. That's another option, is instead of having a cash checking account for flexible spending, you can use a credit card. And then set up a weekly transfer flow from fixed expenses to the credit card to pay off that $300 a month.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
So that you're always kind of like back to zero at the beginning of every week.
Right, like
Okay.
a statement thing.
Mhm,
Yeah.
exactly. And in reality, like, there's some fixed expenses like Netflix, for example, or Comcast, or your utility bills, where you might actually want to put them on a credit card. And so you could encompass those in that same credit card if you wanted to, or set up a separate one. Okay. So like I said, there's some adaptability, but we wanted to start with kind of this more easy kind of framework here. All right, so adaptability, flow-based budget 2.0. So if you have excess cash flow, where does that go? Well, you can establish kind of an order of operations. So take a look at what your current needs are. Do you need that money to go towards something that would improve your life today? Whether that's like, painting a wall, or, saving for something that you're gonna purchase soon. It could go there. It could also go to something that, establish more of a cash buffer, for example, an emergency fund. Or it could go to a more long-term savings and investing goal. Using credit cards is another example we just discussed. Now, another example is couples who might use different checking accounts and then maybe have a combined account for a household account. That's another example of, some people prefer to kind of work their finances that way. And I think there are definitely ways that you can use this framework in that situation as well. But it does take a little bit of a thoughtful approach to that. And then finally, some, debt management. This couple that we looked at, they only had a mortgage, but if you've got student loans, or if you have credit cards or car loans, like that can be part of this element as well, and that can certainly be accounted for in this framework. All right, and I'll leave you with this. Motivation only lasts so long. In order to persevere when budgeting gets tough, we want to focus on aligning our money decisions with our values. Thank you so much for having me.
Do we have any questions? I guess.
Yeah, please. Any questions?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So I know this is called a flow-based budget.
Yes.
But how different it is, because it does seem like what I'm already using, which is called a zero balance budget.
Okay, awesome.
So my zero balance budget is divided where it's like fixed. Like I have all the
Mhm.
categories built in, but my goal every month is to make sure that I'm at zero.
That's perfect. Well, I think it sounds like you're on the right track. Are you using separate accounts, or are you doing it through like an app? Does that make sense?
So I use an app to do the budgeting, the planning
Mhm.
portion, and you can link your accounts. I
Mhm.
haven't done that far,
Mhm.
gone that far with it. I just track it myself
Mhm.
currently. But the accounts thing is something similar that I'm debating on.
Yeah.
It's like most people nowadays have like 4 emails. And
Yeah.
I'm like, but how many
Yeah.
accounts do people have? And I do feel like I have my business side, so
Mm.
accounts there, and then
Yeah.
I have my personal.
Mhm.
So I think altogether I've got like 6 accounts.
Yeah. And that can feel a little complicated, right? Like that.
Yes.
The whole purpose of this is like we want to reduce the
Yeah,
decision
simplify.
fatigue. Yeah, exactly. And so that we know like that's where this is flowing. It comes from this account, and that's where it goes. So I think it is very similar to a zero-based budget, because at the end of the day, we are accounting for every dollar and making decisions for them, because we don't, we want to make sure that all those little buckets are being filled and that we're utilizing them in ways that fulfill like what our values are and also are protecting our future selves. And so that, I mean, it really is a zero-based budget. I think the difference here is that this is very focused on setting up the structure and the behavior so that, you know, any flex expenses, you're carrying this debit card, you're using this. You don't have to make decisions about the fixed and the non-monthly on a daily basis. You touch those at different times. You mentioned, you know, business accounts, and that's really another good example of, you know, the adaptability and how, like, yeah, everybody's situation is very different. But that is a good example where you want to definitely keep those types of expenses completely separate, you know, from the personal expenses. Like, that's very important. And so having that parameter for what expenses will qualify as business expenses. So if you go to Costco, for example, and you're buying water and snacks for the office, but you're also buying, you know, your household groceries and whatnot, that you're using different cards, right? You're going to use my card for, you know, you're paying from this account, the business account for the snacks for the office, and for your groceries at home, you're going to pay from a different account. That makes sense? Does that help at all, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Sounds like you're on a good track. Any other questions?
Any particular apps to use? I myself, I'm a write it down person. Yeah, I need to see it. And I
Yeah.
can't say I've been learning about budget, but I
Yeah.
have just implemented it, and I can kick myself
Really?
if I'm noticing where a lot of money goes to unnecessary things, like big time.
I get it.
So any suggestion on apps that's
Yeah.
easy to use?
Apps that are easy to use. I think there's
Good budgeting.
Yeah, I think there's a learning curve with most apps, to be
Yeah.
quite honest. Like there's one called You Need a Budget, YNAB for short. It's a great budgeting tool.
Okay.
And it also kind of focuses on this like idea of having basically every dollar has a job. So every dollar that's coming in, you're allocating to a different portion of your budget. You can use that well in conjunction with this type of framework because you can categorize your expenses based on fixed, flexi, and non-monthly. So that's a really, really good app is YNAB. They have a lot of online resources. Like they have a podcast and they have a YouTube channel. Like you could get really into YNAB if you want to. Another one is Monarch Money. That's a really good option as well. They have nice visuals so that you can kind of track your spending over time and see where those categories go. Another one is Rocket Money. So Rocket Money, I think it's owned by Quicken. Does that sound right? I think it's owned by Quicken. And that's another really good option. I like Rocket Money a lot. And it basically what they do is they link up with your checking and savings and money market and all the different accounts you have, including investments. And it pulls in all of that data and it auto-categorizes it for you. Sometimes it gets things right, and sometimes it doesn't, and you need to go in and like change it. So for example, like you know, it might, like if you go to a restaurant that's called like I don't know, the farm place or something, like it might think you're buying like farm implements, right? You know what I mean? So like you have to go in and you have to say, oh, actually this is food. This is eating out. So it does take some time to set up. I will say the one really big advantage to doing it the way that you're doing it, which is paper and pen or using Excel, is that you're really in charge of it, you know? And behaviorally, when you have to go through the process of writing things down, I don't know about you, because I have done this before myself, I spend so much less because I'm like, I don't want to have to go through the effort of writing down that I went to the gas station and I bought a donut. Like, I don't want to have to do that. So there's a little bit of a behavioral trick too that comes with that. I don't know if you've experienced that, but
Yes.
it's like, I don't want to have to save this receipt and then record it later.
I use a credit card for a lot of stuff, just for the cashback purposes.
Yeah.
So, the credit card, you know, it has every transaction on there. I just end up writing it down from there.
Yep, that's a way to do it.
Some of the little stuff that I don't use a credit card for, it may be just something just really small, so it can get overlooked.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 3 buckets, obviously, fixed, flexible, non-monthly. Let's say a couple gets like periodically through the year, like a big chunk of money.
Yeah.
Which account would you immediately put it in, and then is it always the fix? Like, yeah.
Such a good question. So, everybody's kind of income situation differs, right? So, in a kind of perfect world, we're gonna base the overall budget on kind of the fixed monthly amount. So if you receive a salary that's pretty even throughout the year, you kind of wanna base, you know, the fixed expenses on that salary, for example. If you get lumpy income, so you get a bonus, or you get, you know, if you have your own business and you have a really good quarter, a really good month, and you have additional cash flow come in, that can be a really good opportunity to fund that non-monthly expense bucket. So especially if especially if you don't have the current like cash on hand currently to kind of give it like that boost that it needs to be. That kind of periodic cash flow that comes in could be a really good opportunity to fund that. Above and beyond that, if that's income that's coming in that you don't need for monthly expenses, like you don't need to make the fixed expense, for example, and it might be a little bit more, you have more leeway and discretion over how it's spent. That's where it's really advisable to have a type of order of operations that you know to go through. It's almost like your own checklist. So you say, okay, do I need things in my house? Like, are there things in my life that I need to purchase to improve my standard of living or to, increase my ability to perform in my job, those types of things, right? So if I need those, okay, I'm gonna buy them because I just received this income and it's not accounted for. Do I need to increase the cash on hand that I have in my non-monthly expenses in my savings here? Okay, I'm gonna add some to this bucket. Do I need to earmark some of these funds for a short-term goal, like purchasing a car or replacing windows or whatever that might be? You're gonna set that aside in kind of in that same non-monthly bucket, but it's gonna be earmarked for one of those future expenses.
Yeah, so there's really nothing, or the SOP, like my thought process, I have to go through that every single time. So then I'm just like, oh, is there a way, and obviously I have a partner, so
Yeah.
he just like acts like it's tax money, and it's like, oh yeah, it's gonna pay for 10 things. So I was just like trying to figure out, maybe the secret is where the money goes first. But non-monthly might be the best one, right? I like that.
Yeah, and I think, I think having kind of a standard set of operations of like, these are the questions I'm gonna ask myself, and having identified what those short-term financial goals are and what your long-term financial goals are, then where are those avenues that this can go. So that it's not, like if you don't have a plan for the money and you don't make a plan for the money, the money will create its own plan. It will do something else, and it won't be what you want, right?
Yes, it
It might be what you want in the moment, but if you ask yourself a year from now, it may not be,
It's
So,
disappeared.
that's right. Burn a hole in your pocket.
Yeah.
Really great questions. Anything else? Awesome. Well, you guys have been really awesome tonight. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your engagement.
Open my eyes to a whole lot of stuff. So.
Good. Thank you.